This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
Hello and welcome to the Niall and Andrea podcast. It's myself, Niall, and Andrea Cleary here.
I'm going to tell you something, Niall. I just had a slice of bar and brack and a cup of tea.
It's spooky season. And in a way, what we're going to be discussing today is very suitably spooky, Halloweeny, eerie.
I think so.
Unsettling kind of music. We are going to be doing a deep dive on this episode into one of my favourite albums from 1998. Boards of Canada's Music Has the Right to Children. Yeah, Boards of Canada's Music Has the Right to Children when it came out in 1998. A very important release in my personal discography, my personal canon, music listening canon. We're going to be focusing on this album, which is their debut album, released in 1998. They are an enigmatic duo, or are they? From the outer hinterlands of Edinburgh in Scotland, so not actually that far. I always thought they were like lived off some island or something like that, but no, they lived just outside Edinburgh. This is a modern electronic classic, and I want to discuss why that is and what it is about this album that's so special. And the reason we are covering this album is because later this month, on Wednesday, October 30th, at the Big Romance, Music Has the Right to Children, it will be the focus album, the listening album on our listening party. Listen closely. So Big Romance, about 7 o'clock Wednesday, October 30th, in the Big Romance, Parnell Street. Myself and Andrea and 30 to 40 of you guys will be gathering in the back room of the Big Romance and playing this album in full volume from vinyl, from the original, from a brand new vinyl record, and listening to it in full. And I'm really looking forward to this and that experience, because this is a perfect album for understanding and listening to those like subliminal small little details on that record, on that Toby Hatchett system. It's going to sound great. Tickets are on sale as of the release of this podcast, niall9.eventbrite.com. You can find the tickets for that. They're a tenner each. Always a lovely night. Last month we did Father John Misty, which of course we did a 2-hour episode on very recently. So it's my turn this month. So I'm indulging myself with this Music Has the Right to Children. Let's play Olsen. So before we get to Music Has the Right to Children, let's focus a little bit on what happened before then. How did they get to this point? Boards of Canada are Michael Sanderson and Marcus Owen, and they were born in 1971 and 1973, respectively. I was kind of interested in what age they were, because, you know, they had this idea that they're quite enigmatic, but really they aren't that enigmatic. There was always this idea that they didn't play gigs or they didn't give interviews, but they gave plenty of interviews, and they did perform live around the release of this album, 1997, 98. April 1998 was when this album came out. And it wasn't revealed until a Pitchfork interview in 2005 that the duo are actually brothers. So they didn't want anyone to know this fact, because at the time when they came out, they didn't want to be compared to Orbital, essentially, the Hartnell brothers. They didn't want to be like, oh, the electronic duo who are brothers. So they kept that kind of a secret. So Michael and Marcus are actually brothers. They did actually give us plenty of information about their background. Like many of their Warp Records counterparts, most noticeably Aphex Twin, who we did a full episode on before, of course. The brothers were making music a long time in their home from a very early age, 6 and 7, messing with mixing synthesizers with cassette recordings of shortwave radio as far back as 1981. So when they were about 10 years of age, setting the scene for what would come. They were inspired by arcade video games, sci-fi, paranoia, and TV soundtracks of that era. Were a big influence on the duo, like The $6 Million Man and movies like The Andromeda Strain. They made homemade movies on Super 8 film and were creating the film's soundtracks themselves. They often talked about how they were creating cinematic worlds to go with the music that they were making. New wave pop music was an influence too. In particular, Devo was mentioned and The Human League.
Little people like your offspring, all alive for some god sucking, put us watching, put us waiting.
So the name Boards of Canada came from, first of all, the family relocated several times between northern Scotland, London and Alberta in Canada before Mike was the age of 10. Their dad was worked in construction and helped and got a job over there, so the family moved over. They moved back. They spent most of their time, though, living just outside Edinburgh. And by 1984, age 13, Mike was already visiting a local recording studio and making rough demos. Then the pair began producing more structured songs using borrowed tape machines, analog synths, and live drums, as well as completely abstract collages of found sounds from radio and TV. Kind of the genesis of what would become Boards of Canada and Music Has a Right to Children. In the late 80s, they would produce cassettes of their music and give them to friends and family before destroying the tapes. Myth or fact, we will never know, but some of the music survived, but not much of it. According to a bio from 2007, Mike recruited a few friends to form the first of several incarnations of a proper band. Marcus was drafted in initially as a bass player, but he soon emerged as a co-writer and co-conspirator of what the band was later to become. At this point, the band had a fairly traditional live setup: guitar, bass, keyboard, drummer, and occasional vocals, but the emphasis was on minimal atonal electronic songs, a sound that easily stood out amongst the abundance of traditional rock and hair metal bands the audiences in their local area were used to. The lineup of the group changed frequently, and Marcus was later quoted as saying they had gone through at least 14 other musicians during the period, a statistic Marky Smith would have been proud of. They went on to create a studio of their own and build up a cache of audio equipment, synths, samplers, and instruments. Marcus went off to study artificial intelligence in college at the time, so early to be studying that, but very prescient. They said, weird science has always fascinated us, and numbers. Marcus studied artificial intelligence. It influences what we do. For me, it's more numbers and their shape. I've always been fascinated by the relationship between music and numbers. The psychedelic experience goes in this direction. It can help us see things in terms of numbers and shapes and structures, as if music were made of crystals. Now, a lot of that kind of stuff would feature on a later record. GeoGaddy, a lot of talk about subliminal messaging and math and all that kind of stuff in and the secret messages in GeoGaddy, which came after this album. But for now, like every summer, Mike and Marcus would collaborate with their friends under the name Hexagon Sun to throw late night outdoor parties in the countryside near their studio in Scotland, where bonfires were accompanied by electronic music, processed television themes, films, projections, and reverse speech tapes to create an exciting, if slightly threatening atmosphere. These nights, which the band still occasionally organised to this day, became known as Red Moon Nights after an early event which was dramatically backdropped by a blood red full moon. So that was from a bio from the late 90s. So such is the feverish devotion to Boards of Canada. A few short clips from a now defunct website, including a 27-second clip of a song called Duffy, came from those cassettes they were giving out to friends, is much coveted by fans. I will play a little track here. So So you can hear very much like the kind of bright, treated, decaying synthesizer, old vintage synthesizer sound is very much present already in their early work. In 1996, the band released their first proper EP, which was called High Scores, which was released on the SKAM label, which released a lot of dance music at the time and was kind of adjacent to Warp Records. Sean Booth of Autechra heard the release and put them in touch with the label in the first place. And then they began chatting to Warp Records, which resulted in the joint release of Music Has the Right to Children on SKAM and Warp. Before we continue, High Scores now is an album or an EP that I really love. I think it's very different to Emerges in the main. There's only one song on it that would end up on Music Has the Right to Children, but it established their kind of warped, wobbly electronic sound. Definitely had more of a dance music, almost electro kind of feel. I'll play this track called, it's like one of those typical Warp bands who you don't even know how to pronounce this word, Nglogax or whatever. That's how you say it. Nlogax. Here it is. Clearly a more like electro kind of sound to that one on the start of that track anyway, and it's said that they might sample Last Night a DJ Saved My Life, the famous dance track by In Deep. Later on in that song it gets a bit weirder and more Boards of Canada-esque. Yeah, so that's kind of what the vibe is of High Scores. Here's a bit of a track called June 9th. So for those who may have expected that Music from the Right to Children would move further into what their peers were doing, the likes of Warp Records being released on Warp, very much like IDM and all of that kind of...
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about IDM. What
it's an
about
American
that?
term. It's an American term. Here
It's been a while since I've heard
it was
it
called
used.
brain dance. Sometimes it was called intelligent dance music is what IDM means. So... yeah, I mean, what would we call it now? Because like dance music and electronic music has splintered so widely now that the kind of almost chin-strokey electronic music of the 90s is kind of a little like, what do we call it? Like, what do we call it now?
I don't know.
IDM.
To me, this album always felt ambient. Like, I feel like there's
it's
a
like
space.
ambient electronic, right? It's like...
there's a space in the ambient umbrella for
intelligent
Boards of Canada.
techno is another term people have.
I don't like that because
No.
what's the other stuff then?
It's not techno.
It's for dumb people. Like what?
Yeah,
you know, it's made
that
by
idea,
dumb people
like
for dumb
higher
people.
art is like, this isn't music
Yeah.
for dancing; it's music for your brain.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you'd like this if you liked classical music. You'd like this music. You know, it's all a bit elitist and weird. And I think they don't like that. I think any artist who has been described as an IDM artist has like pretty, you know, emphatically rejected the label, and quite rightly, because it's odd.
For sure. So, I mean, that's kind of retroactively what we call it, but I think ambient electronic is what it really is. The album, Music Has the Right to Children's, 18 tracks, 71 minutes, features a creeping nostalgic collage of analog electronic music, drawing on found sound samples from public service broadcasting programming, with inspirations from and to hip-hop beats, techno, and psychedelia. Now, there is all of that is in there, but, you know, crucial to this is the name Boards of Canada. They were named after the 16mm educational documentaries made by the National Film Board of Canada, which they became familiar with in the 80s when they moved there. And a smattering of the film's audio track would become integral to their work, particularly on the likes of Music Has the Right to Children. There are bits and pieces of that sampled in there, but there's also the kind of stuff that very much nostalgic and music and cultural ephemera of the past. Sesame Street pops up an awful lot in this music, and more than I thought, actually. But it does explain, like, Music Has a Right to Children is very much the sound of childhood nostalgia. It was released when they were 27 and 26, respectively, doubling down on the more unsettling and dissonant aspects of their music with analog synths, sample speech of children from the aforementioned National Film Board of Canada films, and unlikely sources like Sesame Street. The title is a flip of a phrase that they heard saying children have the right to music, so they flipped that on its head. This is analog music in a CD world. Very much at the time, all that was happening in the world of music was, especially in the world of dance and electronic music and pop music, is like everybody was looking forward. People were looking forward. The CD was big. It was the era of the CD. Digital music was coming, and at the same time, Marcus and Michael were just looking back. They were not interested in the future. They were interested in a different type of future. And the future they were interested in was one that we had in the 70s, one that we looked forward to, one that we thought was coming, which never really arrived. Like, music was barreling forward, but they were always looking back. And it kind of echoes that kind of their obsession with tape machines and kind of analog equipment, which is decaying and doesn't stay constant. A bittersweet attraction to the bygone, as author Simon Reynolds called it. And they told Enemy in 1998, an image of something you can't quite remember, but it sounds like it should be familiar. Let's play a track from the record called Turquoise Hexagon Sun. That track also featured on the High Scores EP. It was the only track that made its way to Music Has the Right to Children, and it kind of has that weird liminal feeling that they have created a lot in their music. A lot of what they do is inspired by children's TV, and it kind of feels like you're listening to a Polaroid memory of the past, and that's a big part of where they're coming from.
It's been a weird couple of days, right? Because I've been listening to this album, and just to say, I don't think I've said on the episode, I'm also a really big fan of this album. So I've been listening to this album kind of, during the week, and 2 nights ago for a Juvenalia episode, I watched Ghostwatch, which was the BBC sort of hoax.
Oh yeah.
Where, and there's that's very much a timepiece. Not like it was 1990 or 1992, and essentially the idea of that was that the ghost was in the machine, right? And then last night I watched Threads, which has only been shown like 3 or 4 times. It's the BBC production based in set in Sheffield, a dramatization of what will happen to Britain if a nuclear bomb falls on it. And it goes, it actually goes something like 10 years into the future, but you see a kind of a day by day, leading up to the bomb, and then day by day after the bomb, and the nuclear winter and all of these things. And there's something about these 3 texts kind of converging in this week for me. Music Has the Right to Children, Ghostwatch, and Threads has me in this like weird mindset, like this sort of, you were saying like this is an album that sounds like a memory, but also that sort of like that idea of like retrofuturism that isn't optimistic or isn't necessarily optimistic. And I feel like that's sort of where I'm sitting with it right now, because I've always felt like this is an album that is about like the texture of memories. Like not necessarily, like, to me, the first thing that comes to mind to me is like, this album sounds like the memory that you have of visiting your uncle's house for your communion, but you don't remember what your uncle said. You don't remember what the weather was like. You don't know what you talked about, but you remember the texture of the couch. Like, you remember what material the couch was made of. You remember the pattern of the wallpaper. You remember the smell of tobacco as like a tobacco packet is being opened when your uncle is rolling a cigarette. And it's those sort of textual memories where the meaning of it is kind of gone. You don't remember what the memory meant, but there's a hangover. There's a kind of a ghostly sort of, you know, sheen to the memory. Because you're like, I was there, but was I? Was anyone else there? Was I alone there? Did I make that up? And this album always to me kind of sounds like that. You know, it sounds like a memory, but it's not one that you remember well. And it's that, you know, that tape decay, that Basinski thing where, like, you know, it's decaying over time, and as you get older, your memories are getting more and more fractured and potentially misremembered and filled in by other things.
Well, isn't that what they say?
Which is
about
also kind of
memory in
AI-ish as well.
Yeah,
you know?
it's true. Yeah. And like, look at the album cover. Look at the album cover. There's a family. There's a collection of people on it from that 70s kind of time. Faceless, because in a dream you can't quite maybe remember exactly who it was, but you have an idea of who it was. And it's scratched and decaying, and it's very ephemeral. It's not substantial. It's a liminal thing. And that's something they really, really did a lot, very well. And that's what their music conjures up for a lot of people. Yeah. Certainly myself as well. Yeah, it has that kind of feel to it. You can see then, I mean, it came in a later album and they sampled the line, the past inside the present. And that can kind of explain a lot of what Boards of Canada are about. But it's also the past inside the present and the retro future. They embody all of that. But they also embody the imagined future that never arrived, further splintering their music atmosphere into a kind of a parallel retrofuturistic place, like a liminal place for it to exist. And
there's something kind of like post people about it. Like, when I listen to it, it's kind of like that Holst, you know, the piece about the planets, where you're listening to it and you're like, yeah, this is what I think Jupiter would sound like. This is what I think Saturn would sound like. And it's like, here's the sound of the planets. And to me, Music Has the Right to Children sounds like what I don't know, what the land sounds like when we're done with it, or when it's done with us, you know. So there's a bit of industry in there, and not industrial in the way that we usually talk about, like industrial sounding music, but there is industry in there, in its, you know, in the kind of materiality of the machines that they're using and their obsession with kind of the machines. But then there's also, you know, the children's laughter. There's the kind of warped voices saying things like, I love you, but fed through this tape. And it feels like a kind of a memory of humanity at a particular time, at like a kind of a just post-industrial kind of time where things are changing so much. And they were, you know, in 1998, we were about to enter into the new millennium, and there was a real kind of, I don't know, I feel a real sense of like the millennium bug, and, you know, those kinds of anxieties around technology are really present on this album, but also technology's ability, and we were very much here in 1998, technology's ability to connect people, and for a voice to be able to say, I love you through a tape, like that's there as well. And I think what we're listening to is just like the texture of what's left. It's not quite a memory. It's just,
isn't that what they say about memory anyway? It's like when we remember memories, we're remembering a copy of the memories, and that's why they degrade themselves. The memories that we think we have are just copies, carbon copies, or copies that degrade over time. We think they're built. Our memories are built on lies. Essentially, our memories are built on misremembering what actually happened and inserting. And we
fill in the blanks
details
as well.
Yeah. And that's what the record and the album cover is. It's the filling in the blanks. Well, what are the blanks? The blanks are the faces I cannot see, and the places I cannot remember, and the music I cannot remember but I know happened. Like,
Yeah.
they talk a lot about children's TV as an example of that. It's like we find the echo of the melodies that marked our childhood, and these melodies, for the most part, come from TV, and particularly from children's film and shows. It is a universe that marked our generation. We grew up watching the same TV programs, and for us, is much stronger influence than today's music or other music that we listened to at the time. These are the tunes that stay in our heads, whether we like it or not. So a lot of what they trying to create is a lot of that kind of like that melodic stuff is this wistful retro future. It's this past, it's the children's stuff. It's childhood reimagined, it's childhood misremembered. And their melodic impetus was always strong in their music, no matter how hazy or foreboding their music was. And that makes it very accessible, I think. You know, I mean, even when things are quite, you know, get a bit IDM-y or like, you know, kind of complex in terms of their music or eerie, there is an accessibility to it because they were big fans of melody. They were big fans of how to, you know, make people feel things. And they said that in an interview in 1998 in the unfortunately named magazine Jockey Slut. It's easier to affect people emotionally if you keep things simple. Obviously, there's a lot of great music in the world that's complex, but as far as we're concerned, the important thing is that you can whistle our songs. I think a lot of it is trying to capture a nostalgic feeling buried somewhere in our minds. We are nostalgic people trying to get back to moments from our past. And nowhere is this more pertinent than like right now. I mean, we are living in a time where we're constantly referencing nostalgia. Later on in a second, I'm going to talk about Simon Reynolds and the idea of retromania, because he talks about this record. But one of the other parts of it, other than the children's TV stuff, well, let me play a track, Aquarius. A lot of the way the synthesizers are used on this record is a way of almost like puncturing that nostalgia, of like affecting it, or of suggesting that we're traveling back in time. We're looking for something from the past. And another way in which they do that is that they often use and reference library music, which was music of the time that was kind of had a utilitarian focus. You know, interludes are very important to this record. They're kind of constants throughout here. Whimsical, almost musical phrases that underscore the kind of liminal nature of the music. So we have, there's quite a number of interludes on this record. Let's play
It's my
The Color
one.
of the Fire. Let's play The Color of the Fire. It's interesting that they can take a phrase that's usually in such a modern, in such a positive context, and kind of make it a little bit sinister by twisting it.
Do you feel like
warping
that's
it.
sinister?
It's a little like stoned or something, isn't it? It's a bit like psychedelic. It's a bit like the reverb all on it.
I don't
but that's
hear
the
it as
duality of what I love about
sinister.
them. It's the sweetness and the sinister aspect in one go.
Yeah,
It
I don't
could
get
be-
anything sinister from that. I think to me that is, and obviously all of this is so subjective, and I think like any way you listen to this album is going to be completely different for different people. But to me, I don't know. I hear like a mom and her baby
Yeah.
like sitting on like a 1970s orange and brown carpet in front of a television, and she's trying to teach, and she's, you know, mouthing out the words, "I love you," as though teaching a baby how to say it, you know, and maybe the baby is trying to say it back. And in the background, there's some like BBC television, BBC Scotland program on. I don't even know if BBC Scotland was a thing in 1998 or indeed in the 1970s. But it's like this snapshot. And maybe where the sinister part comes into it is that it is a memory that is gone, or that is almost gone, or that is fading. But I actually get something really sweet from that piece. I think that's a really I think it's a really affecting piece. And to me, it sounds like a mother and her daughter. To somebody else, they might think absolutely. Of their, you know, young people falling in love. Or to somebody else, it might be like, oh my God, the machine is learning to love and we should all run terrified into the woods.
I think that's why I love it. I think it's so, it suggests that duality. It suggests that kind of thing. It's like you can, depending on almost what mood you're in, you can feel a different thing. And so if you feel a bit like sluggish, you kind of can latch on to that sluggishness, that the way that maybe her voice is a bit slowed down, or maybe but that maybe in another way, if you're in a different mood, it might suggest, you know, remembering and thinking about the past and kind of a nice memory. And actually the music is the same as well. There's a lot of dissonance used in, and sudden chord changes in a lot of the way they use their synthesizers. So you hear that a lot. Another one I really enjoy is the one that leads into Roig Biv. It's called Bakuma. So in the 70s, there was a lot of like this kind of library music, 60s and 70s as well. I mean, even further back, if you're talking about the radiophonic workshop and all that kind of stuff from the BBC. Public service broadcasting in Canada as well also did this. So library music in a way is really interesting because it has a purpose. It was made to soundtrack things. It was made to be used in the same way that a lot of us now listen to music and through mood. It was like a mood-based music. It also meant that a lot of the times the music could get quite weird because, you know, it was flying under the radar. It was released by large corporations. It was made often with, you know, people who had access to big studios at the time and a lot of players. So sometimes you get these quite like massively sounding, lovely, lush orchestral music, but also you get this weird, when synthesizers started to take hold of these kind of weird things, and you hear a lot in like the Doctor Who soundtracks back in the day.
It's kind of like the way children's television has always been a place for extremely creative people to see what they can get away with. Even like Irish children's television, but certainly on the BBC, and I'm sure it's the same in Canada. Like just very, very creative people like pushing boundaries. And I feel like people who are creating soundscapes for, you know, the little bit in between the shows that, and their brief might just be, this needs to be uplifting yet comforting, and we want people to stay with us, and it should have like an undercurrent of trustworthiness. And the musicians are like, okay, cool. And then they go off and they make kind of whatever they want, because like, they're the musicians, and then they'll bring it back and they'll be like, yeah, that sounds good. We can introduce the next program over this. So I feel like those sort of, especially in like public service broadcasting stuff, you get really, really interesting creative people doing weird stuff, you know?
For sure. And actually there was a lot of the BBC sound library is now available to browse, not to use in a commercial context necessarily, but you can go and listen to and use a lot of, I don't know if you have to buy it or whatever, but you can look at the licensing of it. But a lot of their sound effects and music that they created over the years is all available now online. Really interesting. And
it's amazing.
The library aspect is something that is, you know, it's very time coded to a specific place and time, almost like that kind of era, but it's also instantly nostalgic as well a lot of the time because of its nature. Like this is something that Boards kind of would return to over and over again. In Tomorrow's Harvest, their 2013 album, it starts with a kind of a library sound. This is Gemini, the start of Gemini.
Getting engaged can be stressful. Getting the right ring won't be at BlueNile.com. The jewelers at BlueNile.com have sparkle down to a science with beautiful lab-grown diamonds worthy of your most brilliant moments. Their lab-grown diamonds are independently graded and guaranteed identical to natural diamonds and ready to ship to your door. Get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com, code LISTEN for $50 off.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
It's like turning on a video game, turning on
Yeah.
a 70s educational TV show,
Yeah.
all those kind of things.
That
I'd
undercurrent
suggest all
of
those things.
BBC trustworthiness, it's there,
Exactly,
you know.
yeah.
We're here, we're going to deliver you the news and it's going to be impartial and you can trust Auntie Beeve, you know. It's
Yeah,
all very
yeah.
jubilant as well. And
Absolutely.
it's so interesting like that, the kind of texture of those things. And it's really interesting to think about what are the sounds of now that are going to, you know, play that role in 30 years, you know. Will it be the sound of a notification on someone's phone, or you know, a phone vibrating on a table, or I don't know, just it's so weird to kind of try and place it, because it's obviously when we were in the 90s and the 2000s, we didn't know what they sounded like. That was just what the world was. But looking back now, you know, we can obviously kind of we can pinpoint a soundscape, but it's so difficult to do something like that now with everything being so fractured and not everybody sitting down and watching the same 3 television stations. And
Indeed. And, you know, like even the more particular aspects of the 90s, say a modem noise or a Nokia phone, like they were a bit more universal than they are now.
Yeah, but they were
But that idea
material
of-
culture. Like they were material objects that we all had in our houses that we're familiar with. And basically now
Like-
the things that we all share are like a laptop and a phone. Those are our commonalities, you know.
Yeah, the cultural ephemera, I think, of a previous era is really important to the current one a lot of the time, and that's something that Simon Reynolds talks about in his book Retromania, a book that I'm due to read again, because I think it has a lot of influence on how I think about pop music and how pop music recycles the past. A brilliant book. In it, he talks about hauntology as a term that was coined by UK journalists, including himself, to cover the British artists mainly, who, teeming with nostalgia, who were kind of plundering the 60s and 70s television program. We're talking about labels like Ghostbox, a lot of really interesting stuff that anytime I ever do a Halloween playlist, I always end up going to that era and using the kind of Ghostbox music, because it has that, it's almost like reimagined horror scores. It has something else going on that you're like, this is nostalgia at its best, but it's also like completely original now. But the beauty of that kind of hauntology stuff is that it's using a language of the past. It's using the language of horror films. It's using Pie Corner Audio is a guy that I think about a lot in this regard. He has made a lot of music over the years that very much sounds like the soundtrack to electronic music that doesn't exist. For example, here is We Have Visitors from his 2020 record, Blackmail Tapes. So very much like using the vernacular of horror synths and all that kind of music. There's also another term which didn't take off quite as well, which was memorabilia. Conveys the same idea. Memorabilia, memory, memorabilia. In Retromania, Simon Reynolds talks about Boards of Canada. And he says, Boards of Canada's artificially faded and discolored textures stir up the kind of feelings you get from watching old home movies that are speckled with blotches of colour, or from leafing through a family photo full of snapshots that are turning an autumnal yellow. It's like you're witnessing the fading of your own memories. Owen and Sanderson achieved these simulated effects of erosion by time by avoiding digital processing and using analog treatments, such as running elements of a track through a defective tape recorder. In one case, they took a melody played on whistles and bounced it back and forth between the internal mics of 2 tape decks until the sound started disappearing into hell, they told Pitchfork. Like when you look at an image reflected within 2 mirrors forever, in the distance it gets darker and green. So the other part of this record that I think we talked a lot about the melodies there and how they're kind of wistful. They're
but I think
nostalgic.
actually, sorry, just one thing on the Retromania thing before we move on is that like the idea that music has the right to children is itself a kind of a Retromania idea. Like we can complain ad nauseum that music from the 2020s sounds like it's from the 2000s, that music from the 2000s sounds like it's from, the 1980s and so on. But the idea that music has the right to children means that music has the right to live on in these kind of reimaginings. And I think that's, I know that's just one interpretation of what music has the right to children means, but I think it's a very apt one considering what it is that they're doing about like, mining the past to create a sense of an imagined future, or an imagined children for the sounds of the past. And I think that's what this album sounds like. Like this is the children of the music of the past that didn't actually come to be, that can't really be photographed correctly. They're just sort of in the ephemera, do you know?
And there's something in that in terms of the way that the beats are constructed in this record. They're not perfect. They're not, while the melodies of this album are super strong, very nostalgic, bucolic, kind of synesthesia, almost synesthetic. The beats are also a big part of the appeal for me in this album as well. There were some very unique ones that when I first heard this album, I'd never heard anything like this in the same way. They said in an interview that rhythms were just a vehicle for carrying strange and beautiful melodies. But I think there's more to it than this, and that's a big part of their appeal for a lot of people. The beats on this record aren't crisp dance music 4/4s. They are somnambulist, kind of broken beats. They kind of are a bit... They sounded like there's one in particular, they sound like they're constructed of snooker balls rattling off each other or sampled through tape machines and warped. They got their own analog quality to them. They definitely keep time, but you can hear the texture and detail of something that wasn't there on the original recording kind of thing. You can hear hip hop as well, electro, breaks, loop drum beats, but ultimately there's something else often happening there. They create something completely different. Here's
it's like organic, like it's like the difference between running a computer program or writing out a maths proof on a piece of paper with a pencil. There's that kind of like organic humanness to the sound, and that's what I like so much about this.
It's like when we talked about
the beats,
Portishead dummy record and how they would literally distress the vinyl records that they were sampling in advance, stamp on them, run them around the floor to kind of dust them up, make them degraded. These kind of details are what pique our ears sometimes, and you can hear that on this record. In An Eagle in Your Mind is a good example. It's kind of got this shuffling squelch as a beat. Let's have it there. You can also hear it in the kind of trip-hop sleepiness of a song like Rue the Whirl. And on Pete Standing Alone, you can really hear this kind of ripped paper almost texture. It's kind of very much leaning closer to that kind of brain dance idea and the complex electronic music that defined their peers, but very much has an organic element to it. So I think there's the textures in there, different kind of textures, organic textures are in that music, in that beats. And common to all the beats is really, I think, that they're not generally, body beats. They're kind of dreamy metronome rhythms that allow the mind to wander and work really well with those kind of elongated melodies that are throughout this album. In terms of some other highlights on this record, I love the insistent low end of Telephastic Workshop, a really unique song, kind of bubbling and stuttering sample paired with a really interesting miasmic kind of synth. Both two sides of the same coin, both pleasing and dystopian. Like it's trying to tell us something subliminal in its clipped insistent. Let's have a listen to that. On 6010, the almost sinister hits of the percussion underscore that feeling as well, but the beat is more kind of immediately demanding, as if it's kind of possessing the listener a bit more. Again, we talk about, how synth sounds can kind of be eerie and kind of echo what we are familiar with through their use of that kind of similar sounds in horror movies. And the short dialogue there that sounds like someone saying, it, puncturing the track, is used in a way that, a vocal sample might be used to puncture or as a refrain in hip hop as well. So there's a lot of eeriness and kind of unease in these records as well. But there's also, like we mentioned, Turquoise Hexagon Sun. If you listen to this again, it has a more pastoral kind of chilled takeout on that sound. And this is where the kind of snooker ball kind of sound come in. And let's talk about the album's most recognizable song, and Boards of Canada's hit, if you want to call it that. I played at the start, Roig Biv. It is that polychromatic, short, wonderful song. It's the poppiest they got, if you could even call it pop. Partly because it's 2.5 minutes long, but it kind of demands repeating. I remember when it first came out, I was like, I just want to keep repeating this over and over again. But mostly, I think, because it's kind of a perfected version of what they do. It distills the evocative kind of nature of their music into kind of almost their theme song, sampling kids from Sesame Street with a really beautiful melody matched to a really insistent, present bass line. So let's have a listen. I'm going to jump in halfway for this one. it's almost childlike wonder in a song because it has that kind of the sample kind of evokes these like children who are really, you know, fascinated by something, and then there's also got wistfulness as well. On the track that comes next, Rule the World, they nature is an influence because you can literally hear at some point birds singing in the background that were recorded while they were making this music.
Like a doom track.
Yeah, it is. That's where that kind of hip hop feel comes in, you know. Like, oh yeah, I would have loved to hear MF Doom rap over this.
Yeah, just that song in particular. I never thought it until, you know, after many times I've listened to that song, but just now I was like, man, Doom would have killed on that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think, you know, the way that they use color in the artwork, like the turquoise and blue and the references to orange, kind of suggest this kind of synesthesia of this music as well. It's very suggestible, obviously. So a lot of people, when they think about this music, they think about colors, they think about orange, think about turquoise and blue and those kind of faded versions of those colors. So, you know, the titles are usually quite cryptic. They said it in an interview. They actually made clear where some of them come from. Some of them are personal, so the listener is likely to know what it refers to. Music Has the Right to Children is a statement of our intention to affect the audience using sound. The Colour of the Fire was a reference to a friend's psychedelic experience. Caney Industries is a company that was set up in Canada to create employment for a settlement of Cree Indians. Olson is the surname of a family we know, and Smokes Quantity is a nickname of a friend of ours. Sound doesn't Smokes Quantity. So why do I love this so much? Why do I love this album so much? I think I love it because it adds up to this very evocative album, very like, it's a brain hug, songs which fire the brain. They make you feel like you are experiencing something old and new at the same time. They conjure all these old memories, imagined, new. It's kind of like a perfect soundtrack to imagining something, to hearing something you thought already existed. It perfectly creates its own world. It recreates childhood and the wonder of childhood, but not necessarily always with the innocence intact as well. It has that sometimes sinister version of it, the copy of a copy, the idea that things might be what you remembered. The smudged face on the cover suggests here is something that you thought was true, but isn't maybe true completely. Here is something that is not made of original origins. It's made of stuff from the past, but it creates a highly original outcome. It's a subtle constructed record. It's got loads of details in it. It's quite restricted in terms of its palette, but it's quite bold as well. And it works really well. I think they would go on to make a number of records after this, generally quite sporadically. And apparently there's another one on the way soon. But generally speaking, they did what a lot of people do on their first record, is they nail something. They encapsulate a singular idea. They created their own world, and other records that came afterwards worked well. Giugiatti is much more interested in subliminal messaging and the idea of maths, as seeing maths around the world, seeing fractals and all these kind of things as how we understand the world. And then later on, they kind of lose the meaning, kind of loses. It gets a bit slower. It gets a bit more chilled out, maybe a bit more predictable, less interesting, I think, in some of the later records.
I do think nice. Day Van Cowboy from the Campfire Head phase is one of my favorite Boards of Canada tracks. That is a great track. To me, like, just the way it opens up in the kind of the final third is just like so beautiful and so incredible. But yeah, I feel like as a piece, as a unit of you know, something that captured something totally unique, it's Music Has the Right to Children for sure. Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, let's indulge yourself. Listen to a bit of Day Van Cowboy.
Oh,
an
yes,
idea
please.
Where they went. kind of where they brought guitars more prominently on that record as well, which was interesting.
Live drums.
Immediately on Geogadi that followed in 2002. I mean, 4 years later, not immediately, but quite of a difficult record. Funny that I was looking at the Reddit Boards of Canada Reddit during the week, and there's a comment on it. I was like, does anyone else feel physically sick when they listen to Gyroscope from that record? And I can understand why. It sounded a bit like this. You could do a whole episode on that record itself and the subliminal messaging, the idea of recreating the satanic panic almost of the past. It's a lot about that. Let me read. Actually, I've got Simon Rell's book here. Here he is. Let me read a little bit more about what he said about the record itself. Said, it took me a while to fall under the spell of music has a right to children, but when it happened, the record took over my life for a good while. The crumbly smudges of texture, the melody lines, the tangled threads of wistful and eerie seemed to have an extraordinary capacity to trigger ultra-vivid reveries that felt like childhood memories. I would experience a flow of images that were emotionally neutral, yet charged with significance. A mysticism of the commonplace and municipal. Playgrounds with fresh rain stifling the swings and slides. Canal-side recreation areas with rows of saplings neatly plotted, wreathed in morning mist, housing estates with identical back gardens, and young mums pegging damp wind flap sheets on clothing lines as clouds skidded across a cold blue winter sky. I was never sure if these were actual memories from my childhood in the late 60s and early 70s or false ones, dreamed or seen on television. The intense association with a specific era and time of my life was partly cued by Boards of Canada's musical choices, their penchant for particular analogue synth tones that recalled the incidental music in 70s wildlife documentaries or the perky yet poignant electronic interludes between mid-morning TV for schools. The group actually took their name from the nature documentaries produced by Canada's Film Board as they watched as kids. Beyond those particular nostalgic associations, Boards of Canada's detuned and slowly modulated synth tones have a wavering mottled quality similar to washed out Super 8 films or a pre-recorded cassette that's been played to death. Music Has a Rights to Children's cover fits the atmosphere perfectly, an overexposed holiday snap of a mum and dad and 5 children posing in front of a mountainous grandeur. In a sinister touch, the faces of the family have been bleached out to complete featurelessness. So yeah, that's what Simon Rell had to say on it. What came afterwards, there's some interesting stuff that happened in terms of, they were on John Peel's show. They released a Peel session. There's some of those, I think later that year, they actually recorded in a session for John Peel, and that became, these were, albums and releases and records that I would pick up on, peer-to-peer networks and stuff like that, or in the early years of like understanding that there's different versions of these songs that exist, and you're like, oh, I didn't know these songs existed, and finding, oh, there's a Peel session version of it. Of Happy Cycling is a track that features on the reissue of the record. Didn't actually feature on the original track listing at all, but it did feature on the American version, which was released on Matador. The album in Europe and UK and Ireland was released on Warp Records and SKAM, one of their jointly, but Matador in the UK. So Happy Cycling is the one that was released at the time in America, and it does feature on a lot of the releases now as the last track, even though there is a kind of a very obvious closing interlude called One Very Important Thought that takes its dialogue from talking about censorship of adult films. Happy Cycling is a beautiful song though. One of my early favorites. It has a lot of that kind of nature feel to it with the birds squawking. It sounds like this. Later on, they would release the likes of Twoism, which kind of gave you a different take on this kind of music. Twoism was something I really loved as well. There was a lot
Me too.
I loved a lot of the music that they released in the early stuff as well, because I like that, music for children, it's not like dance music, but when you listen to stuff like the songs I'm thinking of on that record, Chinook and M9, they're just, they have a very similar kind of feel to it. Let's see if I can just grab this here. Let's have a look at this. This is from Bach Maxima originally, a 50 copy only release from 1997, just before the album came out. So this is Chinook. So maybe more what you'd expect from their peers at that time, and I think why they probably left off the album as well. But not also nice to hear in a different context. This is June 9th on the record. Definitely more kind of Aphex Twin style in that music, so I think they did the right thing in not including that on the record. But it's nice that it exists. Like I said, we mentioned Tourism, a fine record as well. And let's play. Here is the opening track, 69er. Wistfulness is there. It's a much more relaxed kind of music there. I feel like that was probably Tourism perhaps was like made at a different time or before or after, but very much not as burdened by any expectation. It feels like that. Yes, sorry, released in 1995 originally. Spotify says 2002 when you have a look at it there, but because it was reissued then, but originally released in 1995, so much simpler. Now, the other one I want to mention just briefly before we finish up is In a Beautiful Place in the Country, out in the country. Not one I had known about the where it came from until I was looking at the Reddit and my friend Gav was talking to me about it. An EP I used to love. I always thought it was just a really nice kind of chilled out kind of release. It features a song In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country, 4 tracks in total. Turns out, I mean, I never knew what the reference was, but there's a referenced track called Amo Bishop Roden. And it turns out all of these songs are inspired by the Branch Davidian in Waco in Texas, where, some horrible stuff happened and David Koresh and all were all featured. The Reddit suggests that the two brothers did actually visit at the time, or like later after all of this stuff had happened. So yeah, there's always these suggestions that there's like the obsession with the occult and the sinister with some of this very bucolic, lovely music is actually underlying in a sinister place, because the comment, the vocal on this track is a reference to the cult place home in Waco. So this is in a beautiful place in out in the country. You can hear the kind of vocal as well, and it's talking about actually a reference to that. That was released in 2000, November 2000. Definitely when I was in college at the time, I remember having that, and I haven't moved out of my house and my parents' house, and living in Dublin, and kind of going, listen to that on a Sunday night and kind of going, this is really nice, and then not realizing that it references David Koresh's sect, the Branch Davidians. Yeah, so the pictures as well from the records are taken apparently from pictures taken at that ranch. So yeah, who knew? Different. I didn't know that at all. So I guess, the boards kind of.
I thought I knew everything there was to know about Waco, but here we are.
There you go.
I'm like obsessed with that story, and I didn't know that. Yeah,
I didn't know that. Wow.
Give me a cult leader, and I'll read at least 4 books about it.
Okay, good to know. So Tomorrow's Harvest in 2013 is their last album that they've released over 11 years ago,
which I really liked.
Yeah, nice record. Probably doesn't reach those heights as some of the other stuff, but that's okay. 2005 previously, it said they kind of at this point they feel like they're releasing a record every 8-12 years maybe, so we'll maybe do another one soon, maybe. We'll find out, I guess, if it happens. Meanwhile they both live in Scotland. I'm sure they're getting on with life. There were suggestions back when they were maybe worked in universities as well, so the next Boards of Canada could be working with you, Andrea, somewhere. You never know.
Run into them at a conference.
Every now and again it's really nice to just, especially when it comes to autumn, and just to fall back into place with Music Has the Right to Children from 1998. Definitely one of my seminal albums. So if you want to come and listen to the album in full with us on October 30th in Dublin at the Big Romance, 7 p.m, 909.eventbrite.com. Come and join us. We'll be talking a little bit about the record, but most importantly, we'll be playing it as loud as we possibly can. It'll be the longest record we've played so far, so 71 minutes. There'll be a lot to take in, so I'm looking forward to that. So, that is our Listen Closely for this month, and really great.
Thank you, Niall,
kind of
for bringing your
Music
feelings.
Has the Right to Children, Boards of Canada. Let's finish out with a song from them, shall we? One we haven't played yet, perhaps. It's okay. Let's finish this episode with a little bit of a track, Open the Light. And we will talk to you in the coming weeks on the 909 podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
I used to think buying foundation online was impossible. How am I supposed to find my shade when I can't even get it right in store? Then I discovered Il Maquillage. I took their AI-powered quiz to find my custom match, and wow, this foundation is literally my skin in a bottle. The undertone and coverage are spot on. It's so neutral and weightless. I can't even tell I'm wearing makeup. Plus, with Try Before You Buy, you can try your full size at home for 14 days. Take the Power Match quiz now at ilmaquillage.com/quiz. ILMAKIAGE.com/quiz.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
Thanks for listening to the 909 podcast. If you like what we do, why not consider supporting us at patreon.com/909.